I'm fairly confident I've mentioned this to you before, but I grew up on a farm. And it makes sense that the Sunday I choose to talk about farming, my father, the farmer, would be here. This is going to be fun, Dad. But I grew up on a farm, and there seems to be like this sort of romanticized, dreamy type vision of what growing up on a farm is like. For a lot of you in this room, maybe as you think about what it might be like to grow up on a farm, you picture, fresh air and sunshine. You picture cute cows and just being able to take pride in what you do because you did it by the labor of your own sweat. There is such this romanticized notion of what farm life is like that actually there's a whole industry of farmers who will invite people to come onto their farm to pay them dollars to go and pet the cute animals and to maybe go and pick their own apples or their own blueberries or their own pumpkins or whatever's in season at that time and fool them into the notion that maybe they could just quit their job tomorrow and go and live that farm life. And I don't want to burst anybody's bubble if that's what you think, but that sure wasn't my experience growing up on a family farm. For one thing, our farm, we didn't have any animals. My brother raised sheep for 4-H, but we didn't have the facilities on our farm to have those sheep, so it was actually a neighbor that housed them for him. But that was about it as far as our animals went. We were a solely, growing farm. My dad raises corn and beans, and if the market is right, he'll throw some wheat in there too. But that's only if the price is going to be right because, we like money. That was kind of the way that we did things. And I learned at a pretty early age that I was not born to be a farmer. Let me pause for a second and let you know that I have tremendous amounts of respect for farmers. I know what it takes to get the food that goes on my plate. I love and respect my father and my brother, who both are farmers. And I admire them for the hard work that they put into it, but that's not the life that I was intended to have. For one thing, I hate mornings. I hate them. Firm believer the workday shouldn't start till about noon, because that seems like a more appropriate time. That's when I'm actually alert and awake and ready to start my day. I also really like air conditioning, like a lot. I also like being around people, so the idea of being stuck in a cabin of a tractor for 14 hours a day sounds more like a prison sentence than a career opportunity. So I was not meant to be a farmer. I am, at my core, an indoors boy. But when you grow up on a family farm, the farm itself is just unavoidable. You have to do some stuff. We had certain chores that we had to do on the farm, not too dissimilar to what you grew up with. You probably had chores growing up, but your chores probably entailed things like laundry or dishes. Our chores were more like pressure wash a combine and sweep out the grain bins and then do the laundry and the dishes. You never really forget the smell. That is forever ingrained in my body. But if there was one particular job of growing up on a farm, one particular chore that I routinely had to do every single year, but that I hated with a passion, Dad, I hated it. It was picking up rocks in the field. That is the trifecta of just terrible jobs to do. You are literally digging in the dirt to get these rocks up. And so by the end of the day, you are covered head to toe in dirt and filth. And you got dirt in places you didn't know you had places. It's also very labor intensive because you are having to bend over and pick up these things. And some of these rocks would be very big. In fact, I've got one story of a very large rock that I'll tell you one day. Today ain't that day. But by the time the day is over, you're exhausted, you're tired, you don't want to do anything else. And so the option of hanging out with your friends whenever the workday is done, you don't have that. So very boring. This is before the days of streaming music and wireless earbuds, and so you had nothing to take your mind off of the fact of how incredibly bored you were. I think I tried to take my Discman out there once, but every step I took, it kept skipping. It had the anti-skip. What a great lie we all believed, right? But there was just nothing to do but wander acre after acre. And then once you finished acre after acre, hop on the scoop tractor that you threw the rocks into to drive to the next field and do it there. Killing an entire Saturday. Being bored out of your mind. And then, just because you're constantly, as a farmer, you are tilling up dirt, you are moving things up and down as you plant and as you harvest and as you till that land, it's constantly moving more and things up. You'd have to do the same field again next year. It was unavoidable. When I hit the age of 12, I had walked nearly every acre of every field in Howard County, Indiana, and a few in Tipton. It's a boring job. I hated it. I hated it. And yet I couldn't help but notice that my father made sure that my brother and I did it, and he would be nowhere to be found. Nowadays, correct me if I'm wrong here, but I think he just assigns that task to whoever the newest farmhand is to see if they're worth their mettle. Or maybe, do you get Wes to do it too? Yeah, he gets my nephew to do it. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. The girls told me one time, like, I think I want to go work on Papaw's farm. And I went, no, you don't. But that's the thing. Here's the thing about picking up rocks in the field, though. No farmer enjoys it, but it's necessary. It has to be done. If you were tilling or planting a field and you hit a rock big enough, you could break your equipment, leading to the slowing down of the planting the field that you're in, but also every other field you haven't done yet. So you're not just losing out on that time, though, you're also losing on thousands of dollars to repair those things, because if you find a rock big enough, it's going to cause some problems. In fact, I have a standard rule that I've had ever since I moved out of the house, that I don't call him during planting and harvest season because he's mad about something because something broke down. But you have to get those rocks out of those fields if you don't want to have those slowdowns and that cost associated with it. It's a job that nobody wants to do, but it's still something that has to happen. Somebody has to be willing to do this job. There are all kinds of jobs like that in the world that we live in, right? Jobs that nobody really wants to do, jobs that aren't considered to be great or glamorous or fun or noble even, but are necessary. Jobs that we have to have. In fact, over the last really 10 to 15 years, I think, we as a society, we've been kind of reevaluating the constant campaign we had of pushing kids to go to college so that they could get a good job. Because as we've done that and millions of kids have gone through the college system, it meant that there are thousands and thousands of trade jobs that have been left with nobody to fill them. And so now there's a big push to also include trade. We can get things that are jobs that typically people don't want to have. I remember very vividly from 8th grade on, probably even earlier than that, being told by my teachers over and over and over and over and over again that I needed to get good grades so that I could get into a good college, because I didn't want to wind up being a janitor or a trash man or even a plumber. But it turns out in 2025 that janitors, trashmen, and plumbers make really good money. Maybe I needed to be pushed in that direction. So now we're starting to see that these jobs that we once considered to be undesirable, they're becoming the jobs that people are wanting to get because of the good pay, the good benefits, and even the good hours that are associated with them. Because they're necessary, because we need somebody to do those jobs. But even outside of the career field, there are parts of life, there are jobs that we have to do in our life that we don't want to do. Right? There are chores that you've got at home that you don't want to do. Jobs that you don't want to do because they are boring. They're mind-numbing. Some of them are like laundry, and they're just never ending. So no matter, even when you get caught up, you're still going to have more laundry to do. Some of them are gross. Some of the jobs that we have to do as human beings are gross jobs. But they still have to get done. Recently, Mandy and I have been trying to teach our daughters that even though there's a job that may be gross, you still have to do it. I briefly mentioned, I think, before the sermon that we have a dog right now who has a heart condition. And so we have to give him medication for that. And one particular medicine that we give him, it really helps out as far as he's got congestive heart failure, which leads to liquid forming around his heart. And this particular medication is designed to flush that liquid out. And while that's really helping out, it also means that he has to go outside and handle his business more frequently than what he used to. And since we've started giving him this medicine, there have been a couple of times where we haven't gotten home in time. And so we've been trying to teach the girls how to clean that. Yeah, they hate it. They complain the entire time, but we remind them that at some point in time there's going to be a day where they're going to live by themselves, and they have both expressed that they want to have pets. And so you're going to have to do this. Even though it's gross, even though nobody wants to do it, it still has to get done. Though I will admit as a father, it's kind of nice to be able to push that job off on my kids because I don't want to do it. But even in the first century, there were jobs that nobody wanted to do, but still had to get done. Jobs that were no fun or enjoyable or even sometimes incredibly gross, but jobs that still needed to be taken care of. In fact, it's one of those gross jobs that somebody had to do that would lead us to our narrative for today. But it's who would fulfill that job. That is so surprising, that would stand out so much that it had to be mentioned. And kind of like last week, how I mentioned that no respectable series on the act of service would be complete without a sermon on the Good Samaritan, the same is true for today's narrative. So we're going to find ourselves in John chapter 13, verses 1 through 15. It's a narrative that you probably are familiar with, maybe one that you've read many times, but we're going to read it again to see how shocking the actions of Jesus truly are here. So if you got your Bible, you got your app, open it, John 13, verses 1 through 15. It's a sizable chunk of scripture, but we're going to get through it. I love that sound. It's such a good sound. Put your foot away, Dake. John 13. Now before the feast of the Passover, when Jesus knew that his hour had come to depart out of this world to the Father, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. During the supper, when the devil had already put into the heart of Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, to betray him, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hand, and that he had come from God and was going back to God, rose from supper. He laid aside his outer garments, and taking a towel, he tied it around his waist. Then he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with the towel that was wrapped around him. He came, "You wash my feet?" And Jesus answered, "What I am doing you do not understand now, but afterwards you will understand." Peter said to him, "You shall never wash my feet." And Jesus answered him, "If I do not wash you, you have no share with me." Simon Peter said to him, "Lord, not my feet only, but also my hands and my head." And Jesus said to him, "The one who has bathed does not need to wash except for his feet, but is completely clean. And you are clean, but not every one of you." For he knew who was to betray him. And that was why he said, "Not all of you are clean." When he had washed their feet and put on his outer garments and resumed his place, he said to them, "Do you understand what I have done to you? You call me teacher and Lord, and you are right, for so I am. If I, then your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have given you an example that you should do just as I have done to you." Now, as we look, there is a lot going on here. Normally here, this would be where I would kind of pause and try to give you more context to explain some of the things that happened before this text to give us a bigger perspective on where we're at in the narrative. But Easter's coming, and nobody likes a spoiler. So we're going to hold off on that for today. But I do appreciate John being ever so helpful to, even in this text, tell us kind of where we are in the ministry of Jesus. Because this is the night before. This is the Last Supper that Jesus would have with his disciples, the last chance that they would all be together before the events that would lead to the cross. You got to imagine that for Jesus, knowing what's going to happen to him next, knowing what this night actually is, even though the other 12 men in the room are oblivious to it, even though he's warned them over and over again, there's got to be a real heavy spirit to that, right? To know that as he looks at these 12 men, that this is the last time he's going to see them before they're going to face a very traumatic event. Before they're going to see something that none of them ever thought that they would. But John tells us exactly what Jesus is feeling in that moment. And he says in verse 1, can I get that up there on the screen, please? He says, now Jesus knew his hour had come to depart the world to the Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. Can you imagine the kind of emotion that John would have felt as he wrote that verse? Right? John writes this presumably well after everything that's happened. Right? He knows that the cross is coming. He knows at this point in time as he's writing this. But as he's writing about the night before, as he's writing about the last dinner that he gets to have with his master, his teacher, and yes, his friend, the prevailing remembrance that he has of remembering that night is the love. He is thinking about everything that's about to happen as he's writing this down, but the thought that comes across to his mind is just how much Jesus. That's just incredible to me. But I bring that up because I think John was really intentional to write that. Because it is the love that Jesus has for these men that would lead him to the next part of the narrative. Normally in the first century, whenever you would sit down to dinner, it's not quite the way that we picture sitting down to dinner. See, in the first century, typically tables were pretty low to the ground. They were only maybe about 6 to 10 inches tops removed from the top of the ground. And so that meant you didn't sit in a chair to eat. Right? I'm sorry if this spoils your picture of Da Vinci's The Last Supper, but it's not biblically accurate. But we'll cut Da Vinci some slack. He probably didn't know that himself. But typically with the table that low, the way that you would eat is you would lean down on your left side, propping yourself up with your elbow or possibly a pillow there, and you would eat with your right hand. But that meant if you were laying down on the floor like that, that meant that the person seated next to you was doing the same thing. Which meant that if you were eating around with a group of people, as you were leaning down, somebody else's feet were right there. I think I'd be a lot skinnier if I'd lived in first century Israel, because just the idea of having to eat near somebody's feet, and I've lost my appetite. But you would do this sort of thing, and so it was kind of customary with this practice that it facilitated the need for something else, and that was somebody to wash those feet. See, in first century Israel, we've talked about this a time or two, there were no cars. And really only the people who had animals were those who could afford to have animals. And this is under the Roman Empire. And so it's an incredibly oppressive time when not a lot of people are wealthy enough to afford to have animals to ride on. And that would mean you would walk everywhere you went. And Nike and Reebok and New Balance, none of those places existed yet. Footwear that we had at that point in time consisted of essentially very thin leather that would just really cover the soles of your feet, maybe a little bit on the sides, but that would be tied together. It's just a step above barefoot. And so if you're walking everywhere that you go and you're practically barefoot as you're doing it, your feet are getting incredibly dusty and dirty. If you step into a mud puddle, that mud is getting caked onto the side of your foot. And again, while not everybody had animals, there were some. And I've yet to see the animal that's real picky about where they take care of business. And I have yet to meet the person who is constantly watching every step that they take. And so the job of washing feet was one that was gross. It was dirty, it was disgusting, but it was more than that. It was also demeaning, demoralizing, even dehumanizing. Because if you're going to wash the feet of everyone who's present there, that means that you are constantly in a bowed position in front of them. You are acknowledging that this person is above you. It's the job that nobody in the household wanted to have, and in fact, it was the job that was typically reserved for the lowest servant on the totem pole. If your household just acquired a new servant that joined their ranks, First day on the job, the newbie gets to wash the feet. If you were a servant of such high order that you actually had servants under you, and it was your turn to wash the feet, you could say, nope, you're up. Nobody wanted to do this job. It was gross, it was disgusting, but it was demoralizing. And so it was reserved for the lowest servant available. So you can imagine that the actions of Jesus in this narrative had to be incredibly shocking to the disciples. When they arrived in that room, they were probably looking around trying to figure out, like, hey, where's the foot washing dude? Where's he at? Where do we get that taken care of? And yet, they would have been completely surprised, stunned even, to the point of silence. On verse 4, as Jesus rose from supper, as he laid aside his outer garments and taking a towel tied it around his waist, and he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and wipe them with a towel that was wrapped around them. The idea that Jesus, the master in the room, the highest of the pecking order in that area, the idea that he would be the one would have been completely and utterly shocking to the disciples. There is no way that this is the guy who does that job. There is no scenario where this is supposed to be the person that's doing this. Right? This is the one who's been their teacher, their master, their rabbi now for 3 years. He has been the head of everything that they have done. They have sacrificed everything to come and follow after him because there's something so compelling about him. And now, 3 years into that ministry, almost all 12 of them, have come to the belief that this is not just any teacher, this is not just any rabbi, this is him. This is the Christ. Promised to the Israelites for generation after generation. This is the one who has come to set and make everything right. This is the Son of God himself. And so the idea that he would be the one to stoop down in front of each and every disciple, including Judas, and wash the gunk and the dirt and the mud and the whatever else was so utterly shocking, downright controversial. Understand, after 3 years, they've seen Jesus do some pretty crazy stuff, right? I mean, there's one in particular moment, I love this one, where they're walking by and they see a funeral procession with a widow and it's her son who is dead. And Jesus just reaches up, and I always picture it this way. I don't know how you picture it. Nope, boop. And the kid sits up. What? They showed up at their friend Lazarus' funeral at his wake, and they see Jesus say, hey, roll that stone away for me. Hey, get out. And then he comes out. That's a zombie, man. Like, I'm freaking out right there. They have seen Jesus heal people who were blind from the time that they were born. They have seen Jesus take people who haven't moved their legs in years, get up and walk around like it was nothing. They have seen him do some wild things, and yet I can't help but imagine that as Jesus wraps that towel around his waist and as he starts washing their feet, this might be the most surprising thing they've ever seen him do. Because that's not the job that he's supposed to do. If anything, these 12 men around him should be fighting amongst themselves as to who is going to be worthy to wash his feet. And yet Jesus does it without complaint, without problem, without any sort of incident. He doesn't look at them saying, why am I doing the job that you're supposed to be doing? He just does it. And as he finishes, as he goes and he puts the water basin and the pitcher back where it goes, and he takes the towel off from around his waist, and as he puts that back where it goes, he puts his outer garment back on. He comes and he sits back down amongst the disciples. He takes his seat at the head of the table, the place that he was supposed to be the entire time. And he asks the disciples a question in verse 12. He says, "Do you understand what I have done to you?" What a loaded question. All of them are sitting there with their mouths just wide open, surprised at what Jesus has done. And now he's saying, do you understand why? The reality is that they probably don't. Right? They have no clue why Jesus would do this. It would have been well within his power and authority to say, hey, John, we don't have a servant here to wash the feet. You got to do it, buddy. And I'm sure John would have complained the entire time. But instead, Jesus himself does this and then says, do you understand what I have done? And they're not answering, likely because their minds are so blown. And Jesus says what we read in verses 14 and 15. If I then, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. Don't miss this. This is where everything hinges on this. For I have given you an example that you should do just as I have done to you. Jesus tells his disciples that regardless of his title and his rank among them, that he was still willing to serve them in a way that they would have thought the most shocking way possible. And what's more, he tells them that this is the example for them to follow, to serve those around them with bounds. Jesus was willing to serve at a level that would be considered offensive even to this day. I've really tried to think what would be a good modern day equivalent to washing someone's feet. I just don't have it. I don't know what it could possibly be. Maybe picking up rocks in a field. It's a terrible job, I'm telling you. But we would be so indignant to see the Son of God debase himself to this level, and yet he was still willing to do it. He was still willing to serve in the most extreme way imaginable. But understand, even with it being an example, this did not come from a place of superiority. This did not come from a place of even arrogance on Jesus' part. The only reason why Jesus did this is what John tells us. Because he loved them. Because he loved them to the end. When Jesus wrapped that towel around his waist, as he poured that water on their feet, and as he wiped away the dirt and the mud and the gross, he did it for one reason. Because he loved them. Because he cared for them. That's where his heart came from. That's where the service came from. Love is the root of service for us. Can we serve without loving someone? I mean, I guess. But is that going to be impactful? I don't think so. No matter how dirty that service may appear to us, no matter what it requires of us, we are called as the followers of Jesus to be willing to serve with no bounds out of the love that we have for the people around us. When we love first, there's no depth that we're not willing to go to. If I took an informal survey and asked every parent in this room, how much do you love your kid? What would you be willing to do out of love for your kid? I'm willing to bet almost all of us in here would say anything. Right? Am I wrong? We do that because we love them, because we care about them. We love them no matter what. And Jesus is telling us in this act that we are called to love others to that same level. To love them, to be willing to do anything for them no matter what, because he first loved us. Every level of service is meant to be done out of love to the person that we are serving, whether that be our best friend that we've known forever in a day, or whether it's someone we've never seen before, but they just look like they could use a hand right now. As Christians, we are called to love those around us and to demonstrate that love through service. Is it easy? No. But it's what we're called to do because Jesus loved us to that level. To the point that not long after washing their feet, he would willingly go to the cross to suffer and to die so that we could be redeemed. When we first love, the act of serving the people around us won't feel so much like a chore. No matter what it is. Even the jobs that nobody wants. In fact, those are often the ones that make the biggest impact. If I then, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I've given you an example that you should do just as I have done to you.